Everyone said my wife was too old for me. They said I'd eventually leave her for someone younger. 5 years later, my company collapsed. I lost almost everything I'd spent 10 years building. Everyone expected Laura to leave. She didn't. Instead, she walked into my office, sat down in front of my financial records, and studied them for 4 hours without saying a word. Then she looked at me and said 5 words. "Fire the consultant tomorrow morning." I stared at her. My wife had never worked in my industry. As far as I knew, she'd spent the last 7 years organizing events for a small nonprofit. So why did she sound more certain than the highly paid expert I'd just hired? I had no idea. But within weeks, I would discover that the woman everyone had called too old had been hiding something for years. And that secret wouldn't just save my company. It would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I married. Met Laura Bennett at a small business event in Seattle. I was 32. She was 39. I noticed her before I ever spoke to her. 2 people were arguing over a deal. They were about to walk away. Laura said 4 calm sentences. Both of them sat back down. Who was this woman? I thought she must run something important. Later, I found out she'd just organized events for a nonprofit, a small job, nothing fancy. So, how did she know exactly what to say? I didn't ask. Not yet. We talked for 2 hours that night. She asked better questions about my business than my own investors did. She didn't care what I owned. She cared how I thought. I drove home thinking one thing. That woman is hiding something. I had no idea how right I was. My best friend Mark said it first. "She's 7 years older than you." I know. You know what that means, right? That I'm 7 years younger? He didn't laugh. He told me I'd wake up in 10 years still looking young while she looked old. He asked if I wanted kids. He asked if I wanted someone who could grow with me, not someone already ahead of me. I heard it from coworkers. I heard it from my uncle. I heard it from people who had met Laura exactly once. None of them knew what she was capable of. Neither did I, not yet. But Mark's comments weren't the only thing Laura carried. She had another reason this subject cut deep. She hadn't married young, and everyone around her seemed to have their own theory about why. In her 20s, she'd been building her career. In her early 30s, she'd been working long hours, taking on responsibilities most people her age were avoiding. Then at 36, her father got sick. She left her career to take care of him. By the time he died 3 years later, Laura was 39. That's when the comments got crueler. People stopped asking why she was still single. They started telling her she'd probably stay that way forever. An aunt once told her, "At your age, you can't afford to be so picky." A former co-worker once laughed and told her, "At your age, you should probably stop waiting for the perfect man." Laura laughed whenever she told me these stories. But I could see it in her eyes. They hadn't just hurt her once. They'd hurt her for years. She hadn't been waiting around for someone to rescue her from being single. She had simply refused to marry the wrong man just to prove something to people who didn't matter. Then she met me, and the same people who had. Spent years asking why nobody wanted her were suddenly asking why I wanted her. Why is she still single? Then, the moment she wasn't, why would a younger man marry her? They were never really worried about her happiness. They were worried she didn't fit the shape they'd already decided her life should take. One night, Laura asked if I ever wondered what people said about us. "Sometimes," I said. "Does it bother you?" "Only because they don't know you." She went quiet, too quiet. Then she told me something small. People had made her feel too old before, not just for love, for work too. "What happened?" I asked. "It doesn't matter now," she said and looked away. I let it go. That was my first mistake. There would be more. I took her hand instead. "I'm not choosing you because you're younger or easier to explain. I'm choosing you because you're you." We got married a year later. At the reception, Mark stood up with his drink. Enjoy it while it lasts, Daniel. In 10 years, you'll still be 42. She'll be 52. The room laughed. I didn't. I took Laura's hand and walked her onto the dance floor. I didn't look back. But somewhere in that room, a clock had already started ticking. None of us knew it yet. The next 5 years were the best of my life. My company built software for construction workers. It grew fast. I worked constantly. Laura ran our home. But something strange kept happening. When I brought home a hard decision, she asked questions that cut straight through it. Why are your customers taking so long to pay you? Why are you expanding into 3 new cities when your current contracts aren't even profitable? I asked her once, half joking, where she learned to think like that. I read a lot, she said, and smiled. I believed her. I shouldn't have stopped there, but I did. Then everything broke. We expanded too fast. 3 major clients canceled contracts in the same month. A supplier sued us. The bank froze our credit. My best employees started quietly updating their resumes. 6 weeks. That's all it took to drown a company I'd spent 10 years building. I stopped, taking Laura's calls during the day. I told myself I was busy. The truth was I couldn't stand to hear her voice and admit how bad it was. Then I had to sell the house. Not just any house. The one with Laura's father's old reading chair still sitting in the study because neither of us had been able to move it, and I was the last person to admit we were sinking. Word spreads fast when a man is failing. Mark, who had invested in my company, started talking behind my back. Maybe this is exactly what I warned him about, he told a mutual friend. Someone else wondered if Laura would finally leave now that I wasn't successful anymore. The same people who thought she'd leave because of her age now thought she'd leave because I was broke, like they'd been waiting for any excuse to be right. And for one terrible night, I believed them too. I told Laura she didn't have to stay. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Why would you say that? Because you deserve better than this? I didn't marry your company, Daniel, she said. I married you. I wanted to believe I was too far underwater to hear it, so I did something worse. I hired a stranger to fix what my own wife had already been trying to tell me. I hired a consultant, top business school, a client list full of names I recognized. He spoke like a man who had never once been wrong in a boardroom. He had a plan built entirely around growth, new markets, new partnerships, a path back to the top, fast. I paid him more than I could afford. I believed every word. Laura watched. Me signed the contract. She didn't say a word. That night, she asked to see the financial records. You won't understand them, I said. It's one of the worst things I've ever said to another person. I said it to my own wife. She held out her hand. She didn't move it until I gave her the laptop. She sat at our kitchen table for 4 hours. I expected comfort. I expected her to tell me it would be okay. Instead, she started asking questions. Why had I signed a contract where the client paid me late, but my own bills were due on time? Why were 3 of my biggest clients actually losing me money? Why was so much cash frozen in unpaid invoices? Every question landed exactly where it needed to. By the end, I understood 2 things. My wife knew my business better than I did, and I had no idea how. Fire the consultant tomorrow morning, she said. He came from one of the best schools in the country, I said. His clients are companies twice our size. His whole plan is built on growth, she said. New markets, new deals, more revenue. Not one page of it asks where the cash is going to come from to survive the next 90 days. He's planning for where you want to be. You need someone planning for where you actually are. How do you know that? She looked at me for a long moment, like she was finally deciding whether to open a door she'd kept locked for years. Because I used to be the person companies called when everything was already going wrong, she said. Not the person they hired to sound impressive in a meeting, the person they called at 2 in the morning when the impressive people had already failed. And I learned fast that telling people the truth is usually the most expensive thing you can say to them. It cost me my career. The room went silent. What had my wife been hiding this whole time? She told me the rest slowly over the next few days, like she was handing me something fragile one piece at a time. Before we ever met, Laura had spent nearly 15 years fixing companies exactly like mine. She'd started right out of business. School at 22, and by her 30s she was the person firms called first. Real companies, real bankruptcies, real turnarounds. This was her actual career, long before the nonprofit job I thought I knew her for. She was brilliant at it. Then, at 36, her father got sick. She stepped away to care for him. It took 3 years. When he died, she tried to go back. Company. After company said no. One interviewer, younger than her, told her flatly, "You're very qualified. We're just looking for someone with more energy." She heard some version of that sentence over and over. Eventually, she stopped trying. She stopped mentioning it. She buried an entire career and never told the man she married until tonight. "You could have told me," I said. "You never needed my resume," she said. "You needed a wife who believed in you. I didn't think you needed to know that companies used to want my help, right before they decided I was too old to be worth hiring." I sat there with 15 years of my wife's life I had never once asked about, and I finally understood something. The people who warned me about her age had never once considered this. Those 7 years weren't a weakness. They were the whole reason. I still had a future. Laura didn't fix everything overnight. She found the 3 biggest money leaks and cut them, even the ones I loved. One of them was an entire division, 12 people, some of whom had been with me since the start. "There's no version of this where we keep it," she said. I pushed back. I asked if we could find another way. For the first time since the collapse, I saw her hesitate. She went quiet for 2 full days, running numbers I never saw, calling people I didn't know she still knew. On the 3rd day, she came back with a smaller version of the plan, one that saved 5 of the 12 jobs by folding them into the part of the business that was actually working. Not a full win, just a better loss than the one we started with. "I don't get everything right the first time," she told me. "I just don't stop until I've found the least amount of damage." She sat beside me across from our creditors and said exactly what needed to be said. What was left of the team, she rebuilt around the roles that mattered most. I had to let go of things too. The office I didn't need. The car I'd bought just to look successful. The version of myself that measured worth in square footage, and she found the one part of my business that had been quietly making money the whole time. A service I'd almost cut a year earlier because it wasn't exciting enough. "You don't need a bigger company," she told me. "You need a better one." Slowly, the bleeding stopped. But the real change wasn't the business. It was me. 3 years after the collapse, my company was smaller, but it was solid. Laura had quietly started her own consulting business. Word spread the way it does in small industries. Soon she had more clients than she could take. Our story eventually became a case study at a regional business conference. I was invited to speak. When I got there, I found out the keynote speaker wasn't me. It was Laura. I sat in the audience and watched people take notes while my wife explained calmly exactly how she'd saved a dying company. 3 seats from the aisle sat Mark. He'd sold his stake in my company 2 years after the collapse. We hadn't spoken much since. He was taking notes too. Afterward, he found me by the coffee table. "I spent years telling you that you were throwing your future away on a woman 7 years older than you," he said. "I didn't realize she was the reason you still had a future at all." I didn't say anything clever back. There wasn't anything left to add. He found Laura a few minutes later. I watched from a distance. She told me the rest that night. He apologized. Plainly. The way men like Mark rarely do. She didn't make him beg. She didn't remind him of every cruel thing he'd said at our wedding. "You were protecting your friend," she told him. "You just didn't know what you were looking at." That night at home, I asked if she still thought about what people used to say about us. "Sometimes," she said. "Does it still bother you?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." I took her hand. When I was 32, I thought I was marrying the woman I loved. And I didn't realize I was marrying the only person who could teach me how to lose everything and become someone better on the other side of it. They told me I was marrying a woman 7 years too old for me. They were right. They just never understood what those 7 years were worth. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, too old, too slow, too far behind, remember this. The years people count against you are often the exact years that make you stronger when it matters most. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.